All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. If you're still coming on, I'll still look out and admit people, but we do have a pretty large agenda, so I want to make sure we have time to cover it with some time left over for questions too. So again, welcome to this workshop on racial trauma. I'll walk you through what we're going to be touching on today. My name is Chloe Edwards with Voices for Virginia's Children. I'm the founder and staff lead for Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia, which is an evolution of the Campaign for a Trauma-Informed Virginia. I also hold my Master's of Public Policy and specialize in trauma-informed care and equity in particular, cross-cutting issues. I just want to remind everyone too, some Zoom best practices, make sure you are muted. And also encourage you to turn off your screens if you get fatigued. We'll go through setting the stage in a bit. So again, I'm with Voices for Virginia's Children. We're a multi-issue child advocacy organization. We specialize in early care and education, family economic security, child welfare, including foster care and adoption, health and well-being, mental health, trauma-informed care, and equity. We're privately funded, which means pretty much if we're advocating for more funding for the Virginia Department of Social Services, we don't directly benefit from it. We don't directly benefit from any of the things that we advocate for. We're also nonprofit, which means we're nonpartisan. We work with Republicans, Democrats, Independents, et cetera, you name it. And in particular, specialize in convening different organizations with similar goals. We're also home to the Kids Count Data Center, which tracks more than 150 indicators at the state level and more than 40 by locality. It's funded by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Our research director is Lauren Snellings. Another great service that we offer is community assessments. Oh, I need to swap my display. Thank you. Another thing that we specialize in is community assessments. Which you can request, as well as equity assessments, which have been newly popular as of lately. So just to set the stage, we're going to go over some key definitions, including things like microaggressions, white fragility, et cetera. I'll name some examples of some of those definitions. We're also going to break down history pretty much to paint the full picture of what contributes to racial trauma, which includes historical trauma and cultural trauma. We'll analyze the impact of that trauma on the communities as well as on allies. And then we'll go through stress disorders to analyze the individual impact and the symptoms of those stress disorders. We'll end with ways that you can get involved in advocacy and activism and learning to connect this to, again, a solution. So I want to just give a content warning that some of the workshop you may find it triggering. This workshop will be honest. I won't be sugarcoating any of the material. So as a result of that, you may feel a little uncomfortable. You may feel some fragility. I encourage folks to just acknowledge that in the moment. Focus on the intention of the workshop and what brought you here. Try to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And it's okay to take a break and turn off your screen if you need to. If you do find yourself triggered, I wanted to mention the Mental Health of America warm line. Here's the hours that it's open as well. And so feel free to use that or take a picture of the screen in the event that you may need it. So now we're gonna go ahead and get started. We still have some folks coming in, so if you have come in, feel free to introduce yourself to other people that are in the room and feel free to engage. So what is trauma-informed care? I see we have some folks that are from trauma-informed community networks, which is great. And some folks may have some sort of trauma-informed leadership team within your agency. What's important to note is that this approach often puts the survivor of trauma in a framework that shapes them as a victim. Providers are trained to realize, recognize, respond to trauma, and resist re-traumatization. But this framework does not necessarily correct the systems that create collective trauma and perpetuate trauma and systemic inequities. Trauma-informed care is a strengths-based service delivery, which many of you may be familiar with. It emphasizes the responsiveness to the impact of trauma, recognizing the physical, social, emotional, psychological impacts to both providers and survivors, and within the secondary trauma framework for providers. The goal is to build a sense of resilience, control, and empowerment. But this framework is very concentrated in the individual level of trauma, and it doesn't necessarily tackle the root cause of what perpetuates that trauma. So I just want to acknowledge that. Many of you may be familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experience Questionnaire, or ACEs questionnaire. Trauma is often triggered by a single event, childhood abuse, neglect. Also, racism is a trauma, which is not on this well-known questionnaire. It's all about the individual's perception of that trauma, their experience with the trauma. So it's not necessarily a trauma war and comparing and contrasting traumas. Everyone's trauma is their trauma, and you can't necessarily compare and contrast how big or large it is. It creates long-lasting adverse effects on an individual's physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being, but we know the cure to trauma is essentially resilience, so it's not the end-all, be-all. Now, racial trauma is the ongoing result of racism, racist bias, exposure to racist abuse. There can be several components of racial trauma that affects a person's life. It can affect their ability to build relationships, to concentrate on school or work, to trust systems or community members or providers, to feel safe. This trauma is widespread amongst marginalized groups, in particular Black people in the United States, the majority of whom have expressed that they have experienced racial trauma. Now, here's some other very important definitions. I won't necessarily go through all of them, but these are important definitions to familiarize yourself with. Prejudice, which can be an attitude or a stereotype. It can be positive or it can be negative. It's often directed towards an oppressed person and can be damaging because it denies their individuality. Discrimination is the unequal treatment of various members of society based on their intersectional identities, including race, gender, social class, etc. Now, white supremacy, while most people affiliate this with the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazis, white supremacy is ever present in our institution and cultural assumptions that assign values, morality, goodness, humanity to the white group, while casting people and communities of color as worthless, immoral, bad, inhumane, and undeserving. We'll go into racial essentialism a bit later in the presentation. Microaggressions, which I want to flag, note that micro does not imply that these aggressions are small, but rather that they happen on a micro individual level. Microaggressions can have an immense impact. It's everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental snubs or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, it does have an impact. And yes, these do affect various groups. Some of these can even affect white women. White women are also oppressed, but it can affect largely marginalized groups such as minorities. And while the Latinx community, Hispanic necessarily isn't a race, but it is an ethnicity that is also impacted. Now, cultural and historical trauma we'll go into in great detail today. It held personally and transmitted across generations. Family members may have not directly experienced this trauma, but their descendants can still feel the effects of this trauma later. When members who share the same identity, such as skin, color, sex, gender, orientation, they feel they have been subjected to horrendous events, it leaves a permanent mark on their memories and changes their identity in irrevocable ways. It grounds their formation and their identity forever. Examples of cultural and historical trauma can be American slavery, the Trail of Tears, the Holocaust. Many of you all may be familiar with racism. Racism is different from racial prejudice, hatred, or discrimination. It involves the superior race carrying out discrimination across institutional policies, which impacts the marginalized community. I want to note that minorities, those who are oppressed, cannot be racist. They can be prejudiced, they can be discriminatory, but they do not have the privilege to be racist because they do not carry that superior and dominant identity within our institutions. And then many should be maybe familiar with oppression, which is the subjugation of a social group to a more powerful social group for economic, social, political benefit or gain, which the example of that would be slavery. Now, here's some examples of the inadvertent impacts of cultural, racial, historical trauma or white supremacy. It's food insecurity, for example. Then you see a plate, it says price too high. Oftentimes minority communities succumb to environmental traumas, including food deserts or rezoning laws that make it difficult for them to have access to healthy foods in their community, making nearby outlets such as fast food restaurants that may be more accessible costly in order to maintain and also unhealthy. Also, there's populations such as, you could look at the ALICE report by United Way, Asset Limited Income Constrained Population, where they make just enough money to not be able to have public benefits, but yet not enough money to be able to meet their basic needs. So there's a small population above the poverty line that are largely impacted. Frontline workers would be an example, your grocery clerks, your in-home healthcare workers, etc. Another example of trauma and racial trauma would be police brutality. Many of us have heard about the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, and many others. Racial trauma is shaped to be disparities affiliated with racism, including police brutality, and we'll go through what this looks like. Racial trauma has affects several components of a person's life. Like I had mentioned before, in particular, Black people in the United States, the majority of whom have expressed they have experienced racism. According to a 2019 Pew Research survey, roughly 8 in 10 people who identify as Black with some college experience, 81% reported that they have experienced some form of racial discrimination from time to time, including 17% who expressed this happens to them regularly. I want to note that this same report was conducted in 2016 by Pew Research and in 2017 by NPR and reflected similar results. So you can, we don't necessarily have time to engage in verbal conversation, but you can pitch in the chat. Have you witnessed microaggressions before? Have you witnessed racism? What did it look like? What did you experience? If you personally experienced it, feel free to name some examples in the chat. You see here examples of microaggressions, such as statements that indicate that a white person does not want to acknowledge race. So color blindness, we'll talk about criminality, assuming that immigrant or someone of minority status is a criminal. You may hear a microaggression. I heard a lot when I was in grade school, assuming that Asian Americans are good with technology or good at math. So some could be positive, some could be negative. They could also be subtle when you see someone taking up too much space in a meeting, talking over a person of color, dismissing their ideas. And it doesn't necessarily happen to be a person of color, but it also happens to women too, or someone that is of a marginalized identity, such as LGBTQ+, disability community, etc. So if you'd like to name an example or share with each other, feel free to put it in the chat. Okay, you got into the elevator and a white lady got far into the corner and clutched their purse. That's something that folks may experience, and they also visit a mall. They're followed, they're surveillance, they are kept at. Someone keeps asking if they need something. All examples. Ones I've heard are you're quite articulate or you're quite impressive for your age. So younger folks may also experience microaggressions. Encountering someone who assumes that you want to work in cleaning. Mhm. In a Target parking lot and tried to let a lady pick up her keys, and she gasped and asked you to just get away from her. Okay. All examples. I wanted to also note another example of cultural and historical trauma. We often see a lot of examples in the Black community and in the Native American community, but in October 2020, the New York Times reported that more than 5,500 children in total had been separated from their parents in the US at the US border under the Trump administration. Researchers are presuming that about 2/3 of the parents now are being sought to or are already back in their home countries. Some of the families who have been identified have decided that their children would be safer in the United States than in their home countries and elected for their children to stay with family members who agreed to sponsor them. While many families did elect to leave their children with friends and families in the United States, they said none of them made the journey to the country with the intention of giving up their children, and most were forced by family separation policies to make impossible choices. As of 2019, the government had provided contact information for more than 1,100 additional parents who had been separated from their children before the official introduction of the zero tolerance policy. But the government argued that it would not disclose information about the some 400 other parents because those individuals had criminal records that prevented the United States government from reuniting them with their children under Homeland Security policies. The steering committee had been able to locate the parents of 485 children belonging to those 1,100 parents. The rest have not been found. So for many, I do see we have some folks that work in foster care, but a separation from families and children is a trauma. But this particular trauma disproportionately impacted this particular community, particularly the Latinx community, a form of not just historical trauma, but also cultural trauma for those that experience this separation at the border. I also wanted to flag colorblind racism explicitly. Um, Me personally, I've never heard a Black person of color say, I don't see color. The idea of a colorblind society, while well intentioned, leaves people without the language to discuss race and examine one's own bias. Colorblindness relies on the concept that race-based differences don't matter and ignores the realities of systemic racism. I've noted an example of colorblind racism. You see this Facebook post in response to the Black Lives Matter protest that occurred this summer. It says, I have spent more than a decade raising colorblind children who never once questioned the color of anyone's skin. And that is something I have always been very proud of until this past week. Recently, they asked me why a bunch of spoiled little white girls were screaming Black Lives Matter on the town greens of the places they always loved, and I could tell that they were confused and scared. So I had to explain to children that sometimes people are so ignorant and uneducated they need something to make themselves feel self-worth so that they have a reason to bother to breathe any longer. Anyway, thank you, protesters, for corrupting my sweet, innocent babies. And BTW, no lives matter. Mother Nature is pissed. So this Facebook post has several microaggressions in it. I've seen Facebook posts like this on my page all the time where I just have to keep unfriending people with this kind of mindset. But instead of engaging in a conversation with their children about the intention of the protests, why the Black Lives Matter protesters were protesting, the police brutality that occurred, the implications of 400 years of slavery, yes, also a good example of explicit bias or implicit bias. They decided to have this colorblind approach that dismissed the experiences of the marginalized communities, the Black community, that led to the intention of this protest. So again, this is an example of colorblind racism. What it does, it denies that the person's experience with racism. It says, your experience doesn't matter because I don't see color and I'm raising my children to not see color, when it's actually more beneficial to recognize the implications of 400 years of slavery, of the Trail of Tears, of the separation of children on the border, all of those implications that lead to further perpetuated systemic discrimination and racism at the individual institutional level, as well as systemic level. It's more beneficial to acknowledge that and to engage your peers in conversations related to racism and learn about the impacts of that, rather than just saying, I don't see color. Because in reality, we all do. And race is a social construction. When you fill out your census, it asks you what your race or ethnicity is. And so in reality, we all have our biases that we need to engage with and acknowledge. Some other definitions that you should make yourself familiar with are these ones. I'm not going to go through these for the interest of time, and I just want to give you the opportunity to engage in the learning process if you're not familiar with these. So note these other definitions, and there's a whole lot more. You can also go to Race Equity Tools, which is a good resource to familiarize yourself with these definitions and examples of them. Okay, so now we'll talk about a legacy of cultural, racial, and historical trauma. So we're really going to pick apart history and the implications of history, and it's going to be a lot of history. So it'll essentially be another civics lesson and following up with many of which you did not learn in grade school. The United States of America is among the most diverse democracies in the world. However, much of its history includes systems of violence and discrimination that have not only had traumatic consequences for those affected, but also it has affected future generations and communities. For example, slavery in the United States spanned from the 1600s to mid 1800s. It is estimated that 6 to 7 million enslaved Africans were imported to the United States during the 18th century alone. The rapid expansion of the cotton industry in the late 1700s and early 800s made it impossible for Southern states to depend on anything but slavery for their economy. Virginia was the second largest state for the importation of enslaved Africans and the #1 state for the domestic slave trade. And Richmond, Virginia was the epicenter of that trade. Richmond's economic success in the antebellum is largely due to the impact of the slave trade as a commercial enterprise. In fact, in the 1850s, Richmond's biggest business by dollar volume was not tobacco, not flour, nor iron, but slaves. So not only is this history really present in the America as a whole, but we also have to acknowledge what it means for you to live in Virginia and what it means for you to live in Richmond, Virginia, what it means for Richmond to be the capital of the capital with this kind of history. The Constitutional Convention, in this picture, you see all white men. The Constitutional Convention took place from May 14th to September 17th, 1787 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The point of the event was to decide how America was going to be governed. In 1787, the Constitution of the United States of America was signed by 38 of the 41 delegates present at the conclusion of the convention. As dictated by the document would not become the document was ratified by 13 states. The following seven figures are referred to as the founding fathers: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and George Washington. They all played a critical and substantial role in the crafting of America's legacy and the country's new government. We don't see women in this picture. We don't see people of color in this picture. We don't see anyone but white men. So what does it mean for America's legacy to be crafted? Its legacy is a legacy of inclusion and diversity, melting pot. But here in this picture, all that is represented is white men. And so that has shaped the oppression of not just minorities in this country, but also women, white women. And if you happen to be a minority and a woman, that's double oppression amongst any other identity that you may hold that will leave you triple or quadruple oppressed. These documents, for example, the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, a rebuke and a stumbling block to tyranny and oppression. Yet these documents represent key fundamental American values, including rights to life, liberty, property, public good, justice, equality of opportunity, diversity, truth, patriotism. Yet no Black or brown body was able to contribute to America's crafting as an inclusive nation. And no women could contribute to America's legacy as an inclusive nation. What slavery entailed was a significant amount. For example, this is a quite triggering picture, but we see the slave who had probably been recently whipped. In 1619, White Lion brought 20 slaves ashore in Jamestown, Virginia. People were kidnapped in the 17th and 18th century from Africa. Some historians estimate 6 to 7 million slaves were imported, which deprived Africa from its healthiest and most ablest men and women. Trauma included separation from family, writing restrictions, the raping of enslaved women, brutal punishment, and strict hierarchy among slaves, putting the own culture against itself. It also entailed slave codes, which were prohibitions that kept slaves powerless and whites powerful. It included laws such as voting, marriage, literacy, owning property, gathering in large numbers, traveling without permission. Permissions kept whites powerful, including corporal punishment. Whites couldn't legally murder slaves, but but the law was also not enforced, inadvertently making it legal. Slave codes ended after the Civil War, but they were replaced by Black codes. Slave codes increased the number of Black slaves in colonial America because it created suspicion and fear amongst the white population, which led to backlash in order to keep this population under control, to make sure this population did not get too powerful. Other colonies also quickly followed suit. It followed the pattern of the slave codes. And this was initially created by Virginia laws to make that point explicit. It occurred after the Nat Turner Rebellion, which created a significant amount of increased fear in the white community. The new regulations clearly defined slaves as property rather than as people and outlawed them to read, write, etc. It also made it the law illegal for white slaves who felt like they wanted to be good slave owners, which really does not come in hand, but they felt that they were being good slave owners by teaching their slaves to read and write. They would get in trouble. Slaves could not leave the plantation without their master's permission. They couldn't strike a white person in self-defense. They couldn't buy or sell goods or hire themselves out. They couldn't visit the homes of other whites or free Blacks. There was also slave patrols, which is deeply embedded in our police department's history. Slave patrols were used to enforce these slave codes. White men took turns overseeing particular areas in order to catch run-and-run slaves and further enforce the rules. So while Abraham Lincoln abolished slavery, declaring that all enslaved people in the states currently engaged in rebellion against the Union shall then thenceforth be free, Black Americans were unable to celebrate the abolishment of slavery until June 19th, 1865, known as Juneteenth, an annual holiday that commemorates the end of slavery in the United States. It is a holiday now recognized in Virginia. But soon after that followed Black codes. Southern states again enacted a series of laws intended to circumscribe the lives of African Americans. Harsh contract laws penalized anyone attempting to leave a job before an advance had been worked off. They were referred to as pig laws, unfairly penalizing poor African Americans for crimes such as stealing a farm animal. And vagrancy statutes made it a crime to be unemployed. Many misdemeanors or trivial offenses were treated as felonies with harsh sentences and fines. These laws were used to surveillance Black people and further enslave them through the criminal justice system and through convict leasing, which we'll get to. Black people couldn't serve on juries or in state militias. They couldn't vote, start a job without the approval of a previous employer. They couldn't testify. Some states banned Blacks from states. So again, and there's long lasting impacts of these kinds of laws. Which brings me to convict leasing. Most of us think the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation ended with slavery, but that's not exactly true. Embedded in the 13th Amendment, which officially freed all Americans, is a problematic loophole. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. It's the middle bit that was used to continue a modified form of slavery for some 60 years after Blacks were made free. For Southern whites now without their former workforce, there was a clear upside to convicting as many Blacks as possible. Laws, especially around vagrancy, were quickly enacted to target African Americans. For example, in North Carolina, people without jobs could be sent to court. If they could not pay a fine, they were dismissed for a year. If not, they were deemed a vagrant and imprisoned. Newly freed slaves with a cause, however, had to return to their former masters under contract or be leased to a corporation for hard labor. After vagrancy laws were in place, a system called convict leasing emerged across the South. For example, 10% of Alabama's revenue came from the labor of convicts in 1883. In 1898, it had reached 73%. Entrepreneurs began buying and selling convict labor leases for profit. As the money-making potential increased, the incentive to arrest Blacks and poor whites too, of course, grew. Officials claimed Black convicts were better off in this kind of servitude than as freed men. They were shed of their old habits by learning a trade. They would leave prison after being exposed to rigid discipline and regular hours. But there was little incentive to treat convicts well, and they were released out to work on a plantation or in a coal mine. After all, they had little interest in the convicts' long-term health, and by law were no longer entitled to their offspring. So convict death rates were 10 times higher in the states with these lease programs. In 1873, 25% of Black convicts died. Secret graveyards were common. This practice still exists and has contributed to modern day slavery in the form of the privatization of prisons and the prison industrial complex. Today, African Americans are incarcerated at nearly 6 times the rate of whites, constituting to 1 million of the roughly 2.3 million people in jail, and many prisons still require inmates to work jobs like road maintenance, cleaning city buildings. Georgia, which ended its convict lease program in 1908, inmates are paid $20 a day. The program saves the state an estimated $3.8 million per year. So these are private corporations that benefit off of the prison labor in the United States currently in today's times. The workers are not only cheap labor, but they are considered easier to control. They also tend to be African American males because of the overrepresentation of African American males in the criminal justice system. Companies are free to avoid providing benefits like health insurance or sick days. They also don't need to worry about unions, demands for vacation times, raises, or family issues, so it benefits them. According to the Left Business Observer, the federal prison industry produces 100% of all military helmets, war supplies, and other equipment. The workers supply 98% of the entire market for equipment assembly services, 93% of paints and paintbrushes, 92% of stove assembly, 46% body armor, 36% home appliances, 30% headphones, microphones, speakers, and 20% office furniture. Airplane parts, medical supplies, and more. Prisoners are even raising seeing eye dogs for blind people. With all of that productivity, the inmates make about 90 cents to $4 a day. Here are examples of companies that invest in the prison industrial complex. They even receive a tax credit, which offers an incentive to provide labor for work release inmates that they employ for hiring risky target groups. There is also Jim Crow. In legal theory, Blacks receive separate but equal treatment under the law. It actually, in all actuality, public facilities for Blacks were nearly always inferior to those for whites when they existed. In addition, Blacks were systematically denied the right to vote in most of the rural South through the selective application of literacy tests and other racially motivated criteria. The Jim Crow system was upheld by local government officials and reinforced by acts of terror perpetuated by vigilantes. In 1896, the Supreme Court established the doctrine of separate but equal, Plessy versus Ferguson, which you may have learned about in grade school. After a Black man in New Orleans attempted to sit in a whites-only railway car, that case was enacted. Quote unquote, travel in the segregated South for Black people was humiliating, recalled Diane Dash. She was a freedom writer. The very fact that there were separate facilities was to say to Black people and white people that Blacks were so subhuman and so inferior that we could not even use this public facilities, the same ones that white people used. This has also led to the new Jim Crow. Jim Crow isn't necessarily over because of Plessy versus Ferguson. The new Jim Crow today, an extraordinary percentage of the African American community is warehoused in prisons or trapped in a parallel social universe, denied basic civil and human rights, including the right to vote, the right to serve on juries, and the right to be free of legal discrimination in employment, housing, access to education, and public benefits. And there's this book is written by Michelle Alexander. If you'd like to read more, it tackles the war on drugs, which was an implicitly biased policy in the functioning of the US criminal justice system. It goes more into the privatization of prisons and the new Jim Crow. So again, all of these historical implications are layered and layered and layered on top of each other, which leads to present day implications today, including police brutality, which is the unwarranted or excessive force. It could be illegal use of force against civilians by US police officers. Forms include assault and battery, torture, murder. Some broader definitions may include false arrest, harassment, intimidation, verbal abuse. Today, Black men and boys are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police over the course of their lifetime. According to a Rutgers University study, police killings are the 6th leading cause of death among men of all races, ages 25 to 29. The proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences reported that about 1 in 1,000 Black men and boys will be killed over their life course. This is 2.5 times higher than that of a white man. According to research findings by the proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, the study found that police killings represent 1.6% of all deaths of Black men ages 20 to 24. In comparison to white men, police are responsible for only 0.5% of all deaths in that age group. The study authors stated that they hope their findings will reinforce calls to treat police violence as a public health issue with profound consequences for public health, democracy, and racial stratification. But it's alarming that one of the leading causes of deaths, while it is heart disease, cancer, COVID-19 currently, but it's also police brutality. These kinds of practices that I had mentioned previously, such as conflict leasing, prison labor, vagrancy laws, Black codes, that leads to further to today's implications, which is broken windows policing. The broken windows metaphor, it argues that by solving a small thing, such as a broken window, instead of focusing on solving major crimes, it will create a safer society. This may include small crimes of vandalism, drunken or disorderly conduct, by being forced to confront the minor problems, it can heavily influence how people feel about their environment, and in particular, their sense of safety is the argument. However, the implementation of broken windows policing escalated to zero tolerance policies, which largely impacted disproportionately minority communities, leading to behaviors of harassment, stop and frisk. The war on drugs is another example of broken windows policing. It led to an increase in police misconduct complaints. And while the argument is that it made communities feel safer, it also disproportionately targeted minority communities and increased police brutality and harassment. That's why if you live in the suburbs versus, for example, the city or in public housing neighborhoods, you're going to see more police activity in those neighborhoods that are more populated by low to moderate income individuals or minorities. It has also other implications, such as the school to prison pipeline. Virginia schools continue to use exclusionary discipline with very young students at an astonishing rate. This was a study that was published by the Legal Aid Justice Center. Virginia's public schools issued over 127,800 out of school suspensions to over 73,000 individual students, which was an increased number than the previous reported year. Black students were 4.5 times more likely to be suspended than Hispanic and white students, and up significantly from 3.8 times more likely in the 2015-2016 academic year. This report was published in the 2017-2018 academic year. And you can still find it on their website. There's also laws such as voting laws, which leads to voter suppression, voter ID laws, voter registration restrictions, voter purges are all examples, felony disenfranchisement, gerrymandering. Voter fraud, voter purges are suppression efforts ranging from voter ID laws, cutouts to early voting, mass purges of voter rolls, and systemic disenfranchisement. And long before election cycles even begin, legislators begin to redraw district lines that determine the weight of your vote. Certain communities and susceptible are more likely to experience voter suppression: people of color, students, the elderly, people with disabilities. 70% of Georgia voters, for example, were purged in 2018 were Black. Across the country, 1 in 13 Black Americans cannot vote due to disenfranchisement laws. 1/3 of voters who have a disability report difficulty voting. Only 40% of polling places fully accommodate people with disabilities. Across the country, counties with large minority populations have fewer polling sites and poll workers per voter. 6 in 10 college students come from out of the state. In New Hampshire, for example, the state tried to block residents without driver's licenses from voting. But we know for folks that may have difficulty with transportation or that kind of access, it can be difficult for them to get a voter IDs, for example. Felonies, for example, in Virginia, people with felonies are not allowed to vote. I believe the ACLU worked on a law. I have to follow up to see whether that was successful last session. And then when I say gerrymandering, it's a partisan drawing of the map. So public officials who are in charge of drawing the maps may try to racial gerrymander or partisan gerrymander in order to increase the likeliness for them to be elected. There was a US constitutional amendment when you voted this year that you may have checked to support the gerrymandering legislation or not support it. There was mixed feedback on it. But there has been known to be gerrymandering that occurs here in Virginia. Let's see how I'm doing on time. Now, another thing that a long-standing impact of housing inequities is manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is the belief that white settlements across North America, white settlement was inevitable and even ordained by God in order for whites to colonize the Americas. Although American public policies had intentionally displaced people of color for centuries prior, 2 of the most well-known examples are the Indian Removal Act and the Dawes Act. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in law in 1830, authorizing the federal government to forcibly relocate Native Americans in the Southeast in order to make room for white settlement, manifest destiny. For the next 2 decades, thousands of Native Americans died of hunger, disease, exhaustion on a forced march west of the Mississippi River, a march now known as the Trail of Tears. Decades later, in 1887, President Grover Cleveland signed into law the General Allotment Act, which is better known as the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act forcibly converted tribal lands into small individually owned plots. The federal government then seized 2/3 of the reservation lands and redistributed the lands to white Americans. Native American families who were allotted land were encouraged to take up agriculture despite the fact that the land was unsuitable for farming and many could not afford the equipment, livestock, and other supplies necessary. The result of this was the erosion of tribal tradition, the displacement of thousands of families, and the loss of 90 million acres of valuable land. But the systemic removal of Native Americans did not end in the 1800s. Between 1945 and 1968, federal laws terminated more than 100 tribal lands in recognition of them being placed under state jurisdiction, contributing to the loss of millions of additional acres of tribal land. While tribal nations have experienced the resurgence in self-governance and self-determination in recent decades, the legacy of displacement, oppression, and neglect in American public policies still affects Native American communities today. Native people endure some of the highest levels of financial insecurity in the country. In 2017, more than 1 in 5 Indian and Alaskan Native people, 22%, lived in poverty, compared with just 8% of white Americans. People are also less likely than their white counterparts to own their own homes and likely to be burdened by the cost of housing. These blatant disparities in housing and economic well-being are due in part to past public policies informed by manifest destiny that stripped Native Americans of land, wealth, and opportunity, as well as generational wealth. There's also been other forms of housing inequities outside of the Native American population that has impacted minority communities as a whole. In 1933 and 1934, in the midst of the Great Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Homeowners Loan Act, HOLC, and the National Housing Act into law to prevent foreclosures and make rental housing and home ownerships more affordable. On paper, that all sounds very good. However, these maps assess risk in part based on a neighborhood's racial composition, designating predominantly non-white neighborhoods as hazardous and coloring those areas red. That's why it's referred to as redlining. This process denied people of color, especially Black people, access to mortgage, refinancing, and federal underwriting opportunities, while perpetuating the notion that residents of color were financially risky and a threat to local property values. As a result, just 2% of the $120 billion in FHA loans distributed between 1934 and 1962 were given to non-white families. Today, approximately 3 in 4 neighborhoods, 74%, that the HOLC deemed hazardous in the 1930s remain low to moderate income, and more than 60% are predominantly non-white. In short, while federal intervention and investment has helped expand homeownership and affordable housing for countless white families, it still undermines the wealth building in Black communities today. It's also led to other practices known as gentrification and colonization. And I do want to note that before the practice of redlining occurred, white flight occurred. So as minorities begin to move into suburban neighborhoods, white flight occurred. And now the same minorities that were moving into the neighborhoods that they were forced to settle in today are being removed from these neighborhoods because of gentrification, which is another form of colonization. So just as trauma is multidisciplinary, so is racial trauma. What are some of the adverse impacts of these experiences, do you believe, that still impact people today? You can type them into the chat. And we don't have time to engage in breakout rooms, but what are your immediate reactions? Okay, we'll keep going. So some of the systemic impacts is the racial makeup or representation in politics. When you think of what it requires to run for public office, it requires wealth, it requires the ability to fundraise and have networks with a lot of money to contribute to campaigns. For example, when you think of how much it costs to actually serve, and when it's the policy making season, you are limited when working your full-time job. Those hours are limited in order to serve as a public official. So who can afford that and who can't? In the House and Senate, at least 114 lawmakers are either African American, Asian, or Hispanic, meaning that more than 1 in 5 lawmakers in the 116th Congress is a person of color, and nearly 8 in 10 are white. This data by the Brookings Institution also notes that there are far more Democratic than Republican people of color. Here's a breakdown of the number of people in Congress by race. For African Americans, there's 53 representatives, 3 senators. For Asian Americans, 12 representatives, 3 senators. For Hispanic Americans, 39 representatives, 4 senators. Since 1870, 160 African Americans have served in Congress, according to congressional data. Of those, 152 have served in the House, while 9 have served in the Senate. 1 has served in both chambers. Though both chambers appear to be getting more diverse with each election cycle, the number of white lawmakers still remains disproportionate to the racial breakdown of Americans in the United States. The United States Census estimates that in 2019, 60.4% of Americans identified as white only, excluding those who identified as Hispanic or Latinx, but about 79% of Congress is white, according to the Brookings Institute data. The institutional impact comes in the form of the white savior in the industrial complex. We'll also talk about the nonprofit industrial complex. The belief that people of color need saving often disregards the potential that people of color have to transform oppressive conditions within their own society. The white savior industrial complex refers to the institutional merging of practices and processes that validate white privilege. Slavery is an example of this ideology. The slaveholders believed that people of color needed their saving. They needed them to moralize them, to civilize them, in the argument that they were savages. The same ideology exists today, especially when white people go into predominantly countries of color, such as in African countries that exist within Africa, to save the children. A direct example of the social harm the white savior industrial complex causes is the orphans taken from their countries, from their parents, to local agencies in order to meet the demands of Western adoptive parents. Realistically, communities of color are well off without the interventions of white saviorship. For example, Black Wall Street portrays the potential Black communities of color have. It was the wealthiest community in the United States. But in 1921, it was destroyed by the Tulsa Race Massacre and burned down by white mobs. Black and brown people know the potential of their communities, but this potential is often limited by the perpetuation of privilege within these institutions. Another implication of the institutional impact is the nonprofit industrial complex. Despite recent calls for nonprofits to stand against hate, the history of racist organizing at its root is more about fear than hate. The nonprofit industrial complex refers to the systems of relationships between the state or local and federal governments. It exists within foundations, nonprofit, social service, and social justice organizations. What it does is results in surveillance, control, or development and everyday management of political movements. It refers to the monitoring and control of social justice movements. What it does is it redirects activist energies into career-based models of organizing instead of mass-based organizing, which is capable of actually transforming society. It allows corporations to mask their exploitative and colonial work practices through philanthropic work. It encourages social movements to model themselves after capitalistic structures rather than to challenge them. When we think about when slavery was illegalized, Black communities still were impoverished as a result of slavery. And as a result, that's how the nonprofit sector was created, by white women who wanted to help the minority population, likely to, with a willingness to help, but it was also a result of white guilt for the implications of slavery. And so that's created the white nonprofit industrial complex. That's how nonprofits were birthed in America. So well-intentioned, but ultimately when nonprofits are implementing their services, you have to ask yourselves, especially when they make these Black Lives Matter statements, how many people of color do they have on their board? Is the board all white and they're making a Black Lives Matter statement? How many people do they have working the front lines versus people of color in leadership? And so that will really give you an idea of the nonprofits' intentions to authentically impact the communities that they serve. Do they come up with solutions in collaborations with the communities impacted by their solution, by their mission? Or do they offer the solutions because they feel they know more than the communities that would actually utilize the services? So we just have to be intentional in the nonprofit field about engagement with community and about representation within our own organizations. Now we're going to talk about the individual impact. One that you may know, if there's Dr. Nadine Burke Harris's book called The Deepest Well. Um, she talks about epigenetics, which is the study of how your behaviors and environments can cause changes that affect your genes and the way that they work, but it doesn't necessarily impact your DNA or change your DNA. Animal studies, mainly carried out on mammals like rats, prove that an emotional environment early on in pregnancy or after childbirth can lead to epigenetic changes for a lifetime. Studies show that baby rats who are groomed and licked by their mother tend to have less anxiety and stress as adults. In humans, the cortisol receptor in the fetus brain receives signals and the change takes place accordingly. Those children who suffer from abuse or experience prenatal stress tend to have similar epigenetic changes. However, the argument is that if babies are groomed well, kept in a loving environment and close to the warmth of their parents, they grew up to be less anxious and stressed. And we'll kind of go into a little more of the implications of the many traumatic stressors that I had mentioned before. We'll go through post-traumatic stress disorders, which is a mental health condition triggered by a terrifying event, either experience it, but also witnessing it. Symptoms include flashbacks, nightmares, anxiety, as well as uncontrollable thoughts about the event. PTSD contributes to a pattern of behaviors and beliefs impacting those who were enslaved, their communities, and their ascendants today, but we'll also talk about how it impacted the majority race and the oppressors. So we'll go through all of these disorders. I'll mention Dr. Joy DeGruy a lot. She's my Shero, but she studies the disorders that we'll talk about today. And she also has a book that I'll mention at the end. But there is the perpetration-induced traumatic stress disorder, which is a psychological consequence of violence against human beings on the person perpetuating the violence. There is post-traumatic mistress syndrome, which is really interwoven into post-traumatic master syndrome. It's to do with the mistress relationship with the master, the interactions of white women with imperialist, white supremacist, patriarchal capitalism, and the collective struggle that lies at the intersection of race, gender, and class, which is both specific to white women to undo the historical legacy connected to post-traumatic master syndrome. Post-traumatic master syndrome describes the interlocking and overlapping partnership that has maintained violence, the unnaming of violence, the normalization of violence, and it kept it securely in place, both of what occurred in the big house on the plantation as well as outside of it. Dr. Joy DeGruy often references how white people have also been impacted by this traumatic legacy of multi-generational violence, racial superiority, and the justification of 500 years of trauma and dehumanization that Europeans and their descendants in the institutions produced. When we say white women, we are not necessarily referring to a personal identity. We are referring to a dominant or mainstream identity with certain images, messages, and narratives that have been used to uphold systems of oppression. It is an identity that many who have experienced socialization as white and female often have to negotiate with, whether by resisting, conforming, imitating, subverting, or distancing. It's the negotiation and the relationship to white women that we are investigating, whether it is the identity or a past identity or the evolving and new identity. It could be a personal or political connection to the effects of this identity. Mistress syndrome, for example, is part of a lifelong journey of personal and collective healing from a multi-layered generational trauma of what it means to be a white woman in America. What does it mean to have this relationship with the master who maintained and upheld the violence? What does it mean to play a role in that? And what does it mean to to grow and let go of that and combat systems of oppression when you're in this intersectional role, why oppressed as a white woman, but also still of that majority culture, that supremacy culture. Now, for the oppressed population, Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is a theory that explains the survival behaviors of African American communities throughout the United States. It's a condition that exists as a consequence of multi-generational oppression. A form of slavery was predicated and believed that African Americans were inherently inferior to whites. This was followed by institutional racism that perpetuated the injury, but also this racism was internalized as well. It results in multi-generational trauma and absence of opportunity. It results in the ability to maintain a self-esteem because of the way that racism impacts your sense of value. And then it results in ultimately post-traumatic slave syndrome. Key patterns of this behavior is a vacant esteem, along with feelings of hopelessness, depression, a general self-destructive look, a marked propensity for anger and violence, a racist socialization and internalized racism, which is what contributes to a learned helplessness, literacy deprivation, a distorted self-concept, aversion, and more. It impacts the members of one's own identified cultural ethnic group. It also impacts the physical characteristics of one's own identity and culture group, the way that they are viewed in society. It also affects one's affiliation with their cultural and ethnic heritage, how they engage in that, how they value that, whether they internalize the way in which that narrative has been painted by mainstream society. Which leads us to racial essentialism. I have The Tempest, which is a book by Shakespeare. If you've ever read The Tempest, I was forced to read it in school. It shapes Ariel versus Caliban, Caliban the slave, Ariel the indigent servant. But nevertheless, essentialism was derived from a doctrine established by Aristotle, one of the philosophers also taught in school. The doctrine suggests that all objects have internal properties titled essences, which explains how properties can be grouped into categories. And there's two different approaches to essences. One approach is that essences are the defining factors of one's category membership. The other is that essences are properties that are inherited by category members. Applied to race, which it has been, its features include things such as skin color, aggressiveness, intelligence. Aristotle's piece titled Politics, reason and rationality are the distinguishing factors that categorize humans from animals in that piece. The theory is applied to racial hierarchies and relations. Aristotle outlines natural hierarchies in relations, such as the determinant of whether one is categorized as a ruler or a slave. Those naturally capable of reason were natural masters versus those naturally capable of physical effort under the direction of the reason were natural slaves. Masters are associated with characteristics such as civil, whereas slaves are given animalistic characteristics such as savage. The ideology behind certain racial groups lacking reason was a common justification of slavery. To humanize slavery, it was argued that slaves had an innate lack of capacity for reasoning, and culture required institutional enforcement. For example, in the 18th and 19th century, many states in the American South used the power of legislation to enforce significant fines against anyone educating slaves. Racial essentialism exists in textbooks such as the one mentioned, where Caliban has no reason, power, or no language in the book, versus Ariel, who is described as loyal and gains her freedom. Ariel is the indentured servant. European colonists used the word white to refer to people who looked like themselves, grew to become entangled with the word race and slave in the American colonies in the mid-1660s. The elites created races of savage, which described Indians, subhuman, which described Africans, and white men, which described civil. The social inventions succeeded in uniting white colonists, marginalizing Native people, enslaving African Americans. But what's tragic is that this social construction was used to create race in America, and also those characteristics were further affiliated with race, savage for minorities, and Indian, subhuman for Africans, white, educated, cultured for white men. And that still exists today. An example of that would be on the previous slide where we talked about convict leasing and how people felt convict leasing would give the minorities rigid structure and benefit them in the long run. It also exists in mainstream society when demonstrations for whites are protests is described as demonstrations, whereas for blacks, Black Lives Matter protest, you're tear gas, and it's referred to as a riot. These practices after the abolishment of slavery also during slavery and after the abolishment of slavery has still maintained white slaveholder religion in our society. White slaveholder religion is the religion of the slaveholder equated with the power of God. When slavery was enforced, it had to be moralized in order for the white guilt to be managed. And as a result, slavery was in the name of God. I have this expert from Frederick Douglass who says, "Who gave you a master and a mistress? God gave them to me. Who says that you must obey them? God says that I must. What book tells you these things? The Bible." And certain experts from the Bible were used to teach the slaves that it was in the name of God that they be enslaved. It was also used other slave members who became a preacher had to also teach the slaves within the religion that they had to obey God. So I have an excerpt from an event that happened on Easter Sunday in 1873. White men in Colfax, Louisiana, massacred over 100 Black freedmen. The freedmen were defending the courthouse where their fragile, newly gained freedom was being legally protected. The intent of the Colfax massacre was the reassertion of white power over former slaves. The white men in Colfax were found that their act of violence imitated by others who also rejected the post-Civil War social order known as Reconstruction. To them, the thought of living as equals with former slaves was just not wrong. It was against what they understood to be the will of God. It's no wonder that they called themselves redeemers and chose to theologically pregnant the term redemption to define their movement. Jonathan Wilson Hargrove, director of the School of Conversion, talks about white slaveholder religion. He added yet another perspective of how racism appears in communities when addressing the concept of white slaveholder of religion. He stated, "I understand it is the way that we have inherited a theology that justifies a system that was set out to exploit Black labor. And that system has morphed into and changed over the years, but it's the root of the inequality that we see in our society today, including health inequities. For some people, that means they feel a moral duty to uphold the system. For others who are often on the receiving end, religion, it becomes a way of controlling and internalizing a sense of guilt and shame about the challenges faced." I try to expose the lies of slaveholder religion because also it recovers faith as a source of resilience and knowing that we have the power to change these systems. Slaveholders and their allies use the Bible to support their arguments in favor of slavery and of the economic system that kept them dependent upon slaveholder. However, these patterns were inherited from the 19th century and they're still used today. Slaveholder religion has taken a spiritual toll on the United States. It perpetuates a split in the gospel in two. It warps us, but the faith that was at the heart of the civil rights movement is also still with us. So I'm not saying that religion is a horrible thing, but we also have to recognize how religion was used to perpetuate slavery and how that practice is still integrated into some practices of religion today, creating a split. Another example is a song that was written by John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace. After joining the Navy, Newton renounced his faith and plotted to kill his shipmates. He was so difficult to work with, the crew of the Harwich decided to transfer him to a route in India, which was the route of a slave trader. But the change in ships did not suit Newton's temper. They decided to leave him in West Africa during one of the slave missions, not quite marooned, but not far from it. Newton connected with an actual slaver. He joined the crew of a slave ship and openly challenged the captain by creating catchy songs about him filled with curses and language unlike anything anyone had ever heard. Sailors were known for their foul mouths, but Newton's was so bad, the slave captain almost starved him to death for it. In this work, Newton learned how he was a wretch due to his participation in the North Atlantic slave trade. In life, he set out to help abolish it in England. Newton connected with William Wilberforce to the British Parliament, who led the charge against slavery in Britain and ended it in the Empire in 1807. However, Amazing Grace has been sung at several funerals in Black American church services. Even President Obama sang it at the service for South Carolina State Senator Clementa Pinckney after she was one of the 9 Black people murdered in cold blood by Dylann Roof. Newton was candid about his disregard of enslaved Americans by calling them lesser creatures without Christian souls, and describes how naked African women and girls were prey for sexual abuse on slave ships, in which he admittedly took part in. Take a moment to think about how twisted it is for the man who wrote this song that has given so many Black people comfort and strength in times of need, used his Christian faith to justify the inhumane treatment of Black people. The irony is that Newton expressed regret for his anti-Black brutalities, yet still centered his own story in his own redemption. Not the story of those who were victims of his violence. It's no wonder many people don't know the history behind the hymn. Amazing Grace, he never even bothered to mention the story of the slave women he raped because it was all about the grace that God gives him. We'll also move into internalized racism, which we talked about white fragility. Oh, I'm on the next slide. So white fragility and reverse racism. I have this quote from one of my favorite shows, Dear White People. It's on Netflix if you all are interested in viewing that show, but it describes Black people can be racist, prejudiced, yes, but not racist. Racism describes a system of disadvantage based on race. Black people can't be racist because we don't stand to benefit from such system. Which brings me to reverse racism, which is often pulled by white people when people of color call out racism in spaces of discrimination or try to create spaces for themselves, like Black History Month or BET. The impulse behind reverse racism is an argument, seems to be a desire to prove that people of color don't have it that bad. They're not the only ones that are put at a disadvantage or targeted because of their race. It's like the racism Olympics. Another example of a malpractice that white people use is white fragility, which because of their discomfort and defensiveness on the part of the white person when confronted about information about racial inequality and injustice, they may try to combat data on police brutality by pointing out data on Black murder, for example, would be a form of their defensiveness. Another example of racism is internalized racism. The doll experiment is a very popular example of internalized racism. It's a person's battle with their conscience or subconscious, the acceptance of the dominant society's racist views, stereotypes, biases. It gives rise to patterns of thinking, feeling, behaving that result in discrimination, minimizing, criticizing, finding fault, and validating or hate for themselves, while simultaneously valuing the dominant culture. Yes, all lives matter is a good example of white fragility. Upon deliberation of Brown versus Board of Education, which was a landmark 1954 case that overturned separate but equal, the Supreme Court justice contemplated oral arguments and pored over case transcripts. But they also considered Black and white baby dolls, unexpected weapons in the plaintiff's fight against racial discrimination. The dolls are part of a group of groundbreaking psychological experiments performed by Mamie and Kenneth Clark, a husband and wife team of African-American psychologists who devoted their life's work to understanding and helping heal children's racial biases. During the doll test, as they're now known, a majority of African-American children showed a preference for dolls with white skin instead of the Black ones, a consequence, the Clarks argued, of the inadvertent impacts of segregation. So yes, it led to a successful Brown versus Brown Board of Education deliberation in the Supreme Court. But what it also proved was the way in which the segregation and the way in which racism was internalized at a young person's age, at the children's age, even before adulthood. Another form of this syndrome is not necessarily race-based, but it is a syndrome that many individuals of color experience. Leah, be quiet. Individuals of color experience is imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is a phenomenon or fraud syndrome. Let me silence my dog. Stop it, Leo. It results in a psychological pattern in which an individual doubts their skills, talents, or accomplishments and has a persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. Imposter syndrome examples include the perfectionist, one person who wants to deliver 100% performance at all times. The expert, even if you're really smart and you know everything you need to do, you're still not smart enough. The soloist who believes that if they need additional help with something, that it undermines their credibility or their sense of esteem. There's a superwoman who's really confident and wants to do it all and wants to do everything easily and well, and often takes on projects all at once to prove that they can. The great mind is a person who judges themselves on ease and speed. They feel like that shapes their confidence and competence. And so there's many people struggle with this syndrome, but it's often also influenced by internalized racism. I use myself as an example. I started my own business at the age of 12 and in-home babysitting and helping hand company for low-income mothers, single mothers, and the elderly. At the age of 17, I became a preschool teacher after work. Please silence your screen as well if you're not talking. At the age of 17, I worked 2 jobs in high school and participated in a career development and program to receive credit for my work. I became a teacher at Kidd University, and at the age of 17, created all of the curriculum for all of the teachers in the school. After graduating, I went to the Minority Research and Law Institute, and my 4-year university, I worked 6 jobs and made the dean's list every semester while also working on behalf of the adoption champion of Virginia's organization, Connecting Hearts, which I was very passionate about because I had to experience Virginia's foster care system. Currently, I worked my way up to director. Currently, I serve on several boards. I launched Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia, the evolution of the campaign for a trauma-informed Virginia. But with all of these accomplishments, the point I'm trying to prove is that imposter syndrome is still real, because as a Black person in America, your worth is constantly undermined. In meetings, you're often spoken over. Your intelligence is undermined. You may be mistaken as an intern when you're the person leading a presentation. All of these factors, all of these microaggressions contribute to imposter syndrome, including the way in which mainstream media portrays minority communities. And so oftentimes minority populations may find themselves being the perfectionist, the superwoman, taking on all of these board memberships, working all of these jobs to work 10 times harder, to be 10 times smarter, but still often succumb to imposter syndrome. So now we'll go into some positivity of how we can be the solution. And there's equity, equality, and I like this demonstration of it a bit better because people aren't outside of a fence, away from the football field. It's not innately exclusive. It's everyone trying to reach for an apple off of a tree. You have everyone with the same stool, but the stool is not tall enough for the shorter person. It's not tall enough for the one that's a little taller than the shorter person. So we see that the person who's tall has the privilege because they're able to reach the apple. Then there's equity, where everyone has a stool based off of their size, based off of what they need, the resources they need in order to reach that apple. So this is what we prefer when we talk about systems, or when you're creating programs or for our community, or doing some sort of volunteer-based work, is consider equity versus equality, the resources individuals need in order to truly be equal. Equity describes the distribution of resources based on the needs of its recipients. We also must address the root cause of trauma. So in Virginia specifically, 19% of children in Virginia experience 2 or more adverse childhood experiences. However, Black children experience trauma at almost double that rate. And the Kids Count Data Center that Voices hosts tracks indicators within this that include socioeconomic hardships, parental divorce or separation, racism, living with someone who is mentally ill, etc. From 2017 to 2018, 37% of Black children experienced 2 or more adverse childhood experiences, in comparison to 8% Latinx children and 15% non-Hispanic white, while 19% of all children experience 2 or more ACEs. So we can see some of the disproportionality there. As it relates to COVID-19 pandemic, as of December 3rd, the Virginia Department of Health reported 15,116 hospitalizations, while the Black community accounts for about 29% of that group. They represent just 19% of the Commonwealth's population. So again, it's disproportionate. Likewise, the Latinx population roughly makes up 24% of Virginia's COVID-19 hospitalizations, but only 9.8% of the population. So again, it's disproportionate. Meanwhile, the white community accounts for 38% of the Commonwealth's coronavirus hospitalizations, but nearly 70% of that population. So it's not disproportionate. Communities of color are experiencing much higher hospitalization rates. Black communities have almost a 10% hospitalization rate in comparison to a 6% average. So disproportionate. So while we have the COVID-19 pandemic, what I'd like to point out is that we also have racism as a public health crisis and the implications that stem from that. So in the beginning, I mentioned how trauma-informed care has limitations, but a healing-centered approach that addresses the trauma, not what's happened to you, but what's right with you, and views those exposed to trauma as agents in the creation of their own well-being rather than victims of traumatic events, can assist the addressing of the root cause of trauma. people are more than what's happened to them is the ultimate argument. They are not just their trauma. While the term trauma-informed care is important, it's also incomplete. First, trauma-informed care correctly highlights the specific needs for the individual young people who have experienced trauma or of any age. However, current formulations of trauma-informed care presumes that the trauma is only an individual experience rather than a collective one. To illustrate this point, researchers have shown that children in high violence neighborhoods all display behavioral and psychological elements of trauma. Similarly, populations that disproportionately suffer from disasters like Hurricane Katrina share a common experience that, if viewed individually, simply fails to capture how collective harm requires a different approach than an individual one. Second, trauma-informed care requires that we treat trauma and people who provide very little insight into how we might address the root cause of trauma in neighborhoods, families, schools. If trauma is collectively experienced, this means that we also have to consider the environmental context that causes the harm in the first place. So by only treating the individual, we only address part of the equation, leaving the toxic systems and policies neatly intact. Other policy interventions include what many may have talked about is reparations. And there's a 10-point reparation plan that varies from a formal apology for the establishment of the African Holocaust Institute, the right to the creation of an African knowledge program, the right to land for social and economic development, resources for health, wellness, and healing of Black communities, education for community development and empowerment. It's a plan that you can Google and find. And then there's also the NCOBRA. Let me see if I know the acronym. I know a lot of acronyms, but not the name. The National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, who is deeply invested in this work if you want to learn more. We ultimately have to correct systematic inequities through justice. Systemic equity is a complex combination of interrelated elements, including sustaining social justice movements. It includes reinforcements that replicate equitable ideas, power, resources, strategies, conditions, habits, and outcomes across institutions. Justice is ultimately the systemic and fair treatment of people of all races, which will inadvertently result in equitable opportunities and outcomes for everyone, so that everyone can achieve their full potential in life, regardless of race and ethnicity. In order to accomplish that, we have to put equity at the center, as well as justice, changing the systems and policies that perpetuate injustice. This is just a speech, advocacy and activism. So advocacy and activism is ultimately individuals impacted by the issue, leading the change through protests and marches. They may have specific calls to actions, such as the divest to reinvest conversation. Advocacy is ultimately to support policy. And when we talk about policy, that means the people at the center of the policy are policy makers. So it puts the policy makers at the system, but it also reinforces policy solutions. Advocacy may require the supporting of our organizations, such as Voices for Virginia's Children, in order to mobilize advocates to ultimately support policies. The difference between these two models is who is at the center. With an activism model, the people impacted, the communities are leading the changes in developing their own solutions, whereas advocacy, again, is to support policy, which puts policymakers or the powerful organizations that work within that at the center. And no model is better than the other necessarily, but in parallel with the empowerment method, which focuses on the change of systems by utilizing strengths, resilience, and resources within the community by focusing on the competence of individuals rather than their deficits, by empowering them to ignite the change that they wish to see in their community, to remove social barriers. We can parallel that approach in order to ensure that the community is at the center of policy solutions. So I use the quote, "not for us, without us," because if a person is impacted by an organization's mission or policy, they should be at the center of that solution. They should have a seat at that table. And so we have to create more seats at the tables for communities impacted by the conversations at those tables. You can also play your role and join the solutions. I have a speech here that I did in the 2020 March on Washington, which again shows how history repeats itself. But everyone has a role to play, whether it is public policies that combat inequities, whether it is advocacy, reaching out to your public officials and allyship, whether it is through rewriting of history in academia or arts or educational entities, whether it is through public good and servitude, whether it is through allyship. Everyone has the role to play, but your role may not be everything per se. So think about the role that you can play. But again, when thinking about like that superwoman complex, we have to recognize that it's not possible to play every role and do it well. So remembering that will keep you less burnt out. We also have upcoming events and advocacy opportunities that you can find at vakids.org/join-us/events. We have a General Assembly advocacy training coming up tomorrow. Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia GA session kickoff, which will break down our policy agenda. For the 2021 General Assembly session, we'll do a justice advocacy training, and then we'll also do a meet and greet with our coalition committees. There's a digital advocacy training because everything will be virtual this session, so you can learn how to advocate digitally. There's a justice advocacy training again on the 13th. On the 18th, we have a MLK Day of Action with Brown, Virginia, other justice-oriented organizations across the state. And then this event is not posted, but we have another event on the 18th, which is a partnership with educational and art entities, VMF, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, the Valentine, the Civil War Museum, the Library of Virginia's Untold program, and Initiatives of Change, where we'll talk about the reckoning of the past history and how these organizations are reconciling the present and engaging community in that. And then on the 25th, we'll have a campaign for a Trauma-Informed Virginia Digital Advocacy Day, where you can put that training into action. Here are some resources that you can reference in order to embrace the learning of constant growth. You can never learn too much, and this is certainly a progress. So creating a society that is authentically anti-racist will definitely take time and require effort on everyone's part. So I mentioned some of these in the presentation today: white fragility, post-traumatic slave syndrome, the new Jim Crow, white slaveholder religion, colorblind racism. You can also visit archives from Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week. You can Google it and it will come up, but you can also visit vakids.org to see that. And there's also Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia, which is a campaign to empower marginalized communities and acknowledgement of truth to promote healing, reconciliation, and justice. And you can also Google that to find our resources and also find upcoming events. Voices will also be doing equity impact statements in each of those issue areas that I had named earlier: child welfare, foster care, trauma-informed care, equity, health, mental health. So you'll be able to see our full policy agenda and how it will impact specific populations. And here is my contact information. You can follow at Racial Truth on all social media platforms. You can also register to receive our emails. You can share your story with us during the General Assembly session. We already have a story form up on our website. Again, if you click on the digital advocacy event page, and you can also attend our events and advocacy days. So now I'll open it up for questions if anyone has questions.